thank you all for joining. It's with a tremendous pleasure and honor that we have Lilian and Damien, who represent the 9th and 10th generation of the Barton family. One of the oldest and most illustrious dynasties to have its impact on the region. And as we have not only one representative of the family, but two, it behoves me to say as little as possible and to pass over to them. But I should just point out that for those who are unaware, that the Barton history in Bordeaux started in 1725, when Thomas Barton originally arrived in Bordeaux and set up his first business. I believe the négociant business of Barton and Guestier is still going strong today. So one of the oldest businesses that was set up about 20 years later. In terms of the history of the chateaux, and most relevant for this evening, Langoa-Barton was bought in 1821 by Thomas's grandson Hugh, and is one of the very few chateaux, and perhaps Damien and Lilian later you'll be able to tell us the others, who has remained in the same family hands since the original Bordeaux classification of 1855, a truly rare occurrence. So we have huge amount of history. At the same time, the chateau is definitely not backward looking, and I hope that you'll enjoy not only the wine this evening, but you'll be conscious of, let's not say a change, but an evolution perhaps. We'll see how the wines evolve both in the glass, but over the different vintages. We're going to be trying the wines in pairs, and we're going to be starting, as per your tasting sheet, with the oldest wines first, the 9 and the 10, then the 12 and the 13, and finally the 15 and the 16. And I'm sure you've got them all open and breathing. Certainly the last four, no, in fact, all of them, frankly, could do with some air, in fact. And once they do, they're really showing their true colors magnificently. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Lilian and Damien, the 9th and 10th generations, respectively, of the Barton family, to introduce themselves and the chateau and take us through these wonderful wines. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, it was such a wonderful introduction. We don't have much left to say anymore. Well, if the question, please don't hesitate to unmute or or put a little text in the chat box, and we'll try to answer immediately. Let's start with a bit of history.
Yes, well, you started off beautifully. Indeed, Thomas came from Ireland. He had ships, so he went backwards and forwards. French Tom, as he was called. He lived in Saint-Estèphe for a while, wanted to buy his own chateau, but in those days, if foreigners bought land, when he died, it went back to the crown and not to the descendants. So he gave up that as a bad idea. And indeed, in the 1720s, he started off the business of Barton in Bordeaux, and which then, after the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, when was imprisoned, we think, in a Fort du Haut in Bordeaux. Rumors, but just for the fun, is that he escaped dressed up as a woman. His wife, Anna Johnson, Anna Johnson still exists in Bordeaux today, bought women's clothes, and that he escaped dressed as a woman. But I think, to be honest, we have paperwork that implies that he was allowed to leave France and went to England and Ireland, where he bought what is today known as the K Club. When he then came back in the 1820s, the man who looked after the négociant business so well, called Daniel Guettier, was made a partner. So it became Barton Guettier B&G in the 1820s. And by then the law had changed also. And he definitely still, the family to buy property and bought Langoa in 1821. And then we backpedaled back to the French Revolution again. The Marquis de Lascaz was imprisoned during the French Revolution, kept his head, which in those days was really quite a good thing, but he had all his goods confiscated. And when he came out again in the 1820s, he didn't have quite enough money to buy back all his property and came to my ancestor and bought part of the Léoville estate, which became Léoville Barton. Now, Langoa in the 1855 classification became a third classified growth and Léoville a second classified growth.
And then, well, here's Hugh, and then we go down to Hugh, who sort of dealt with the... Yes.
Sorry, Damien and Lilian, I was going to ask, maybe at this juncture, you could just say a little bit about the difference between the two estates or the two labels, because I know some people will be interested to understand how they diverge and what the main differences are, perhaps, between
I suggest I'll explain really the difference that stands in the terroir by showing a few maps later on the different terroir of St Julien.
Perfect, thank you.
So then a couple of Bartons dealt from the business based in Ireland, but then the one that really is important later is Hugh Barton, who did not have any children but looked after the property very well and passed it over to Anthony.
Ronald Hugh Barton.
Sorry, Ronald Hugh Barton, who passed it over to my grandfather Anthony, so Lilian's father, who obviously everybody knows here. So it is 10 generations of Barton de Bordeaux, but 8 at Langoa. And we're extremely happy to celebrate 200 years this year of ownership.
We won't be doing a party, unfortunately, but we'll find another excuse.
There's only 3 chateaux that are still in the same family since the 1855 classification. That's Langoa-Barton, Léoville Barton, and Mouton.
Okay, that's the other one.
Mouton, I think, is 1853 or something along those lines.
Okay, they just made it in.
Yeah, just. But there are some other old owners in the Médoc that are not classified. Lamarck, they've had for a very long time, I think. And then if you go to the other side of the river, I think we have people like the Malais Roquefort at La Gaffelière. I think they've been there for a very long time. And I'm sure there's others if we searched around a bit.
Well, just simply as taking the example that's behind us, let me show you a little view of the cellar. We are now in the cellars of Chateau Barton. And we think we are old, but the previous family had this place for ages.
Yeah, 400 years.
We're babies.
Right, yeah.
What else can we say? Well, let me maybe just visualize a little bit Bordeaux. There's a couple of maps, if I may be a little geeky, that to me make a lot of sense to really understand Bordeaux. Just a reminder. So we have the ocean over here. We have the city of Bordeaux over here in the middle of the Caravane-Pessac-Léognan appellation. I love this map because this map doesn't really give this type of soil, but it gives the age of soil. And by having the age of soil, you kind of understand what is under your feet. And this is also why you understand we don't plant grape everywhere. And we plant certain types of grapes in certain places, not by choice, well, not by religion or whatever, but because of what is standing under our feet. So let's start with what's very old. So what is in orange that you can find a little bit on mainly on the right bank. And you can see little dots also on the left bank, especially when you go further north into Médoc, is soil that is between 56 and 65 million years old. So it's a kind of limestone. It's a soil that's been shaped by the oceans, and with compression, it's a very soft kind of limestone that we could resume in chalk pretty much. And this is because it's still fairly hard. This is why when you go to North Medoc or the right bank around Blaye, it's quite hilly. Then if you go slightly more recent, 34 million years old, you have everything that's yellow. There's a patch of yellow, which is extremely famous, where I have my indicator there, is Saint-Emilion. Of course, under Saint-Emilion and Libourne, there's tons of very hard limestone, which Bordeaux has been built with Saint-Emilion. What you see behind us, all this wall is built with this hard limestone. You find a lot in Notre-Dame, the famous quarry till today open, produce one of the world's best limestone for construction. And then another type of soil which is interesting. So everything that's light pink or green, well, everything that's green, this is where there's cognac. So obviously a very different type of soil. And then everything that's orange there is mainly sand, so not very interesting for wine. This is why we only plant on these soil there. But then what brings us to the left bank is this light green band that you can see Q1 and Q2, which is between 800,000 years old and 1.8 million years old. This, in terms of geology, compared to the previous years we've seen, is very, very recent. And this is the glass glacier period. That's huge glacier that starts from the Pyrenees, bringing all these stones, rolling it, taking lots of different types of minerals and depositing just before reaching the ocean, right here in Bordeaux. As it melted, it would deposit a layer of gravel, and then another glacier period would come, depositing a new layer of gravel from different diameter mainly. The diameter of deposits would start from the very finest particles, which is clay, to the largest particle, which is obviously the gravels. For example, you can see there's a patch of green band there, and this is where you find Pomerol. Petreux is very famous for its clay. For us on the left bank, we have some clay, but above this clay we have gravels, and this is what make really the terroir of St Julien so easy. We like to do make good wine, but it's a lot easier with the soil we have. So you really need to understand that there's all these layers of gravel like this a bit everywhere, and there's Terrasse 3 and Terrasse 4, very famous for us. Sorry, it's a bit geeky, but what we call terrasses, these layers. One terrace is a layer that's been deposited for one glacier period. And there's really the Terrasse 3 and 4 are the two that are very important, because these are the one you find in Château Margaux, in St Julien, with on the terroir we have with neighboring, with our wonderful neighbors. The terrace you find also in Pauillac for all the first classified growth. So these terraces are very important, because this is what gives us the most beautiful Cabernet Sauvignon. So we're very lucky to have this kind of soils. And if we zoom in, Saint Julien is actually made of, well, I'm talking a lot. Maybe why don't we grab a couple of wine to start, and then I'll zoom in on Saint Julien a bit.
So the 9 and 10.
9 and 10.
Let's go for it.
I'll get some wine.
Lilian, with regards to this first pair, we have the 9 and 10. I mean, it's a fantastic back-to-back pairing of vintages. Another classic example of Bordeaux coming along in pairs. One thing I do note, though, is a pretty different composition of the wines. With the 9, I believe it's sort of 60% Cabernet Sauvignon, and the 10 at 73%. It's clear that Langoa, perhaps more than some chateaux, is not afraid to change the cépage according to the vintage. But what led to the difference in the composition of the wines in 9 and 10?
Oh, well, of course, it's the lay of the land, and every year, because the rain is more patchy, or because some places have had more sun, or the drainage has been, slightly different than other years, that leads to some differences. And we don't, as you quite rightly say, make wine from a recipe. What leads to the blend is we taste every vat and decide the ones we like best, and we'll do the blend with this. And the rest will go into the second wine, so it's absolutely not lost. But hence why we have these differences is not that we put everything into the wine, nor so the 9s and 10s, when they were young, I thought they were very similar, and it was a big debate as to which one preferred. And I think now, 10 years on, or slightly more than 10 years on, I find that they've grown into their own paths and are now quite different, although two great wines.
Yeah, I must say that if there was a wine to drink tonight, I would go for the 9. But if there's a wine I want to have in my cellar for the years to come, I would pick 10. Obviously, I love both, but there's 9 was quite a warm vintage, and you really feel this. And it's you very often in a great vintage, the wine tends to close down a little bit, become a little austere. Mummy, the teenager.
Yes, I say. Well, they were charming to drink on primeur, not to hard work at all. And then they went through teenage without becoming, spotty with braces on the teeth, and are now growing, more gentle as they go along, and are still lovely wines, and will continue, I think, to grow gracefully for a long time.
Yeah, that's quite lucky to have a great vintage that doesn't really close down like this. As 2010 is a wine that maybe shows today a bit of austerity, but there's really an acidity in this wine that I love. Oh, hello, Fly.
Fly. Say hello, Fly.
And yes, it's a wine that has a bit more austerity, but there's a finesse, a freshness of the tannin that I really like.
And given the slightly differing percentages in terms of the grapes used in the final blend, given the different style of and actually, yes, right. Cheers. Very important. Absolutely. Lovely to see you both. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you. Yeah. Given the difference in vintage and the slight difference in cépage, how do you feel one or other vintage more embodies the character and soul of the chateau, or are they just different expressions of it?
Good question.
Different expressions of it, I would say.
Yeah, same. Yes, different expression. There's when we're going to have the 12. There's one vintage in the whole lineup that really captures Langoa to me. It would be 12. But yes, maybe we'll come back to it later. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, whilst people are enjoying the 9 and the 10, and please do use the chat function actively for comments and questions. Damien, you're very welcome to take us back to your geeky screen shares, because we're all fascinated. We all want to know more. So please take it away.
Okay. So back on another map, which is a bit exaggerated topography, because Médoc, far from being hilly, still has some little variations of soil. And this is how you should resume St Julien. It's 900 hectares. It's 80% or more than 80% of it, I think it's 86%, is classified growth. So really the terroir is amazing. And it's two plateaus of gravels sitting next to each other with different expositions. So there you have the plateau of Bechevel and you have the plateau of St Julien. And to me, this is the best way of explaining the difference between Langoa and Léoville. So you have the Gironde here, and you have the Route des Châteaux that goes over here. And so as Lilian explained, Léoville-Barton used to be only one and only big vineyard with the two other Léovilles. So this is the village of St Julien. You have the Clos de Lascaz over here. You have a plot of Léoville-Poiferré here. This is all of Léoville-Barton. There's another big block of Léoville-Barton here. This is Léoville-Poiferré, and this is Léoville-Barton here again. So if you make this huge circle there around St Julien, all there's a few plots here and there that belongs to Chateau Bridan or Chateau Bechevel, but we're really talking about a couple of hectares, maybe a bit more, but not so much. This big round is Léoville. As Langoa, you find a bit in front of the Creux-Beaucaillou there on the Bechevel plateau, then a little bit this block there behind the forests. And then this side, you can see from the shade that is on the map, is oriented north, which means that so we are low on the plateau. Because we are low on the plateau, we tend to have finer gravels, finer particles, sometimes sand, sometimes more sort of earthy, fresher soil, sometimes even more clay as well. So it's really a cool soil we tend to find there. On the other side, literally opposite, so on the same level but north facing, it changes everything. South facing, because the fact that it's south facing, it takes a lot more warmth, which means that the plants that are planted here take a lot more sun and get ripe and get going in spring and they get riper fully almost every year, as on this side it tends to be a bit more difficult. And this is why these two big blocks of forest is actually a soil that could have vineyards, but we've decided to keep the forests just because we think it's better for the environment to keep forest, although we could plant more grapes. And these two little blocks there, I won't lie to you, they're not always the best. On the other hand, this whole line there is fantastic, and that's also Langoa. And we have this big block there just behind the chateau, which is Langoa. So three islands, Langoa, it's very patchy, and we have quite clay soil over here. We have nice fine gravels there, a bit more sandy there. We have quite an earthy patch there. Over here we have fine gravels, and then here this is really where the skeleton of Langoa is made, where we have the larger gravels. And it's quite interesting to see because on the upper side of the plateau we have the Cabernet. This is where we get the structure. This is where we get, if it was just this parcel, it would be pure austerity, but very elegant grapes. On the other hand, if we had just a block down there in the clay, it would be very delicate. And it's this combination of all this plot that makes Langoa. Because for those of you who've tasted Langoa and Léoville next to each other, Léoville tend to have this austerity, super straight, serious, very elegant. And that's because Léoville is almost just on the top, while we have the chance with Langoa to have some grapes at the top, some grapes at the bottom. And this combination, all of this, makes Langoa rounder, really. And that's, to me, is a signature of Langoa. It has this acidity that we love because acidity brings drinkability, but it has roundness from the variety, and it's very complete thanks to the terroir where it comes from.
The hill of Léoville is slightly higher. So when I say hill, of course, as Damien was saying, we laugh a bit. And I always tease people and say that's because you haven't run the marathon, then you feel that there are a lot of hills in the Médoc. But anyway, the Léoville has to go through more layers of soil to get to the water table, and Langoa has it more accessible in many ways.
And it's quite interesting because the Langoa and Léoville really keep their style. I've been lucky enough a couple of years now to have tasted Langoa 23 and Léoville 23, and next to each other there was with a keen drinker. And Langoa kept his style. It was round and Léoville was straight, and none of them was, there was not one more tied than the other. It was quite fascinating how they really keep their style aging as well. There's a little question there. Can you explain the difference between second and third growth classification?
That leads us into the big question of the classification. So in 1855, or rather before 1855, there was a national exposition in Paris when the Eiffel Tower was built. And it was decided that people didn't really know or couldn't explain Bordeaux's wines so well. So the Médoc was divided, well, some of the better wines were divided into classifications. So we have the first classified growth, which are now Mouton, Lafite, Latour, Margaux, and Aubryon. And when we have 14 second classified growth, of which the 3 Léovilles are 3 of them. And we also have, I think it's 15 third classified growth, of which Langoa is, and there's a 4th and a 5th classification. And this only represents a tiny percentage of the wines of the Médoc. So then you have Petit chateaux. So basically, it's only 60 chateaux that are classified in Médoc and Pessac-Léognan.
I hope this has answered the question.
Thank you very much. Both, indeed, it has. One question that I had as we move on to tasting the 13 and the 12 together is, after looking at that very, very useful last map of the topography, perhaps the difference in terroir is also now being more starkly contrasted with the changing climate as well. And those parcels that Langoa has, which were perhaps a little cooler traditionally, would you say they are now benefiting from these, 18, 19, 20, these more solar vintages?
It's an interesting question. It's very difficult to say if one is benefiting more than the other, because in a way, Cabernet Sauvignon usually has very low sugar, well, much lower than the Merlot. And because of the composition of the terroir of Langoa, well, only has around 60% Cabernet Sauvignon, and quite a lot of Merlot, while Léoville tends to be more around 80% Cabernet Sauvignon, and the rest is Merlot. So I think the maturity of the Cabernet Sauvignon, which some years could have been challenging, is almost perfect every year now. But then the balance in the wine is, the balance in the wine in Léoville is still maintained thanks to the quantity of Cabernet Sauvignon we have, and the balance in Langoa. I guess the kind of fresher soil of Langoa do help. To be honest, I've never really thought about it. That recirculation from the river is really what is key. This huge river. Let me show you a picture so you can really understand how important the river is. It's huge, and because it's so big, it's like a giant radiator next to the vineyard. When it's hot, it's a lot cooler near the river because obviously the water is cooler. And when it's, well, like very early this morning, when it's very cold, it's always warmer near the river because it takes so much time to cool down. So the effect of the river and the Gulf Stream reduces the effect of global warming on our region, and that we're quite thankful. So they're generally speaking more alcoholic wines, but I'm not quite sure if the fact that we've had better, more regular great vintages recently, that just pure luck, or is that really a global warming effect? I hope we won't get a whole decade of bad vintage to come, but there's so much vintage variation in Bordeaux. It's difficult to say if it's luck, or if it's coincidence, or if it's global warming.
Or good winemaking, of course.
Yes, of course. Yes. We're very good at winemaking.
So turning to the 2012 and the 2013, I mean, this is a really fascinating pair, because, if anyone was unable to discern a difference between the 9 and 10, and I can't imagine that was the case, but if they were, there's clearly, these are two very, very different wines we have now, the 12 and 13. So talk us through these, please.
I love the 12. To me, well, this is also the one of the wine we're drinking most at home at the moment. It's to me, it's a Langoa in a nutshell. Maybe Lilian will think of another vintage, but to me, it's round, it's delicate tannins. It offers a lot of the complexity, which is St Julien, with graphite, with cassis, red fruits, the cigar box. It has, to me, this perfect claret in a way. And it's as simple as this, and there's enough acidity to make you want to take another sip, and it's complex enough to keep you triggered with the wine at the same time, and that is
and the 12 is particularly round and charming and easy to drink, and for once it's a vintage that we say, do drink it now, because it's good for drinking now.
But it's also one of these vintage that will still age if you forget about it another 10 years in the cellar. There's no problem at all. And it's a kind of vintage I personally love, because the great vintage, of course, well, they are fantastic and we all love them. But I must admit that I'm often frustrated opening a bottle and thinking, it's still too young. I should be patient enough and wait for another 5 years, and you open it another 5 years later and say, maybe a bit more. And the vintage like 12, 11, 12, 14, the 2007, the 2006, 2002, 2001, they're not considered bad, they're not considered good, and these in between I love.
Yeah, it's
they did quickly and they age beautifully at the same time.
It'll be interesting, I'm sure, in the comments and stuff. It'd be interesting to see what people think of the 2012, because I have to say it is well, it's everything you've just said, of course, but it is, it's a great introduction to the chateau. If you wanted to understand more about Langoa-Barton and have a wine which you could find thoroughly enjoyable now, and showing a lot of, for me, some of the key qualities of the chateau, I think that the 2012 is a perfect wine right now to do so. Now the 13 is obviously, I mean, this is a very challenging vintage, 2013, and it's not often that we see 2013 Bordeaux. So I'm intrigued to taste it now. I'm intrigued to hear your thoughts on the vintage, and how it fits in the general spectrum for Langoa.
Well, 13, 13 wasn't an easy vintage to make, that's for sure. But for a starter, it rained during flowering. And of course, if I remember rightly, it was in the middle of Vinexpo. So that was the end of the 13 before it was even made.
There was buckets in Vinexpo because it was raining so much.
and of course it affected the volumes very, very much. But as I said, in people's minds, it was, 13 is going to be bad. There was still hope for it, but unfortunately the summer wasn't that great, and we didn't have perfect weather. And at the time of the harvest, we had to play very tight between getting top maturity, but also the rain had caused damage, and there was a potential rot coming in. So it was definitely, well, we better go and pick that tomorrow morning. And it wasn't tomorrow afternoon, it would have been too late. Having said that, with modern methods and careful calculation, the grapes we actually put into the vats were the very best grapes and the less exciting grapes, with this horrendous machine called the grape sorter.
Le trioptique, optical sorting machine.
Optical sorting machine, chucked out quite a few grapes. So the 2013, we have made it's the sort of wine that we can drink quite easily, quite rapidly, but very little, because not great flowering, and then a big sorting of the grapes where we really did use only the best grapes in it.
So the result is actually quite satisfying. We're not shy at all to show the wine, especially compared, of course, it's never going to be 2009, but this is what I love with vintages in Bordeaux. It's so fun to play around. I love cooking, and wine like 2013, you can actually have fun pairing it with fish, like monkfish or belly salmon or something that has some fattiness, because it has this high acidity and fairly low tannin, but it doesn't stop from delivering some nice aromas at the same time. And I do have quite a lot of fun playing around with wine.
Absolutely. I think it's a really good example of why we should be quite cautious with critics' evaluations, and that unquestionably, and we're all guilty of it. We're all guilty of it. But if you hear less encouraging things about a vintage, then there is a tendency to write it off, and then this is a perfect example of needing to drink what's in the glass and not what's in your head, because clearly the wine is very charming. It's obviously on the leaner, more linear style, more savory, less ripe, but there's still nice balance there. There's lovely perfume, intriguing perfume, and there is enough fruit, just enough fruit to give the balance. So I think it's a great wine for drinking now.
I found it quite austere for a while, and it's only starting to relax, while the 12 was beautiful and open. So if I were you, I would still sit on these 2013 for a bit, because I think we'll just show a bit more complexity in the years to come.
But I understand you don't all get a chance of tasting the primeur, so you have to rely on people's tasting notes. So there we go.
Actually, another vintage, that press has written off quite recently is a 2017, and that's quite interesting because, 2013, as Lilian said, it was quite bad weather everywhere, and that's because it was raining all summer long. But in 2017, strangely enough, it has quite a bad reputation, but the only problem it had was frost. Places that did not have frost, like St Julien, have been making very, very good wines, and this is why it's quite an interesting vintage, where press or wine merchants such as you have the power to recommend, because some places have been making stellar wines, and because 17 was not considered, because of the frost, a good vintage, the value for money in some wines is just stellar.
Yes, some people arrived in 18 to taste the 17 and said it ends with a 7, so it's not going to be good. So I'm afraid if I knew them well enough, I said that's a stupid remark and go and taste them. And then they said, oh, and anyway it froze, so it's bound to be bad. So I said, well, frost affects volumes usually and not necessarily quality. B, thanks to the river very much, we had absolutely no frost in St Julien, whereas poor Mouzin, sadly, we had nearly 100% loss. And I said, just to finish off the people, I say, and do you remember the 6145, which I think still in people's minds are still considered the best vintages ever. There were two vintages where there were just huge frost.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I think I think, and also 17 after two really quite powerful vintages, 15 and 16, and then obviously 18, which came after 17. It was a nice change of pace. It was lovely to drink Bordeaux's, some of which were only just 13%. It was a return to kind of, you know, classic old school claret, and definitely not a bad thing for it at all.
Yeah, no, totally agree.
Why don't we grab another hair of wine?
I think that's an excellent idea. Yeah.
Well, another, it's not a map this time, but when I've been talking about gravel the whole time, but just a little picture for you to understand what I mean with gravel. This is the kind of gravel we have. And the reason why we are so keen on our gravels is because we are in Bordeaux on the 45th parallel. And on this latitude, on the other side of the ocean, it tends to be quite cold. So we have, well, I mentioned the Gulf Stream, which is in Europe, but we also have the Gironde. But although we have this, it's still not really warm enough to get the Cabernet Sauvignon to mature properly in Bordeaux. So this is why, for example, on the right bank in Pomerol and Saint-Emilion, there's only two exceptions. There's no gravel, so there's no Cabernet Sauvignon. Of course, Figeac and Cheval Blanc won't agree with me, but they have wonderful gravels. So the gravel is gravelly soil, drains very well water. So it's very easy for us to get rid of humidity, which is the main problem in Bordeaux. We have more rain than you have in London per year. Wow. The difference is we have serious showers when it falls. It's just buckets down, and then we have a lot of sun. But we need to know that water, getting rid of the water is important, because then if we get rid of the water, we get rid of rot, mildew, etc. But also the soil warms faster if we get rid of the water. So that's a key factor. So drainage. The second is it's a bit like the stone take the heat from the sun and restore it during the night, and and that gives help the soil to warm faster also in spring, and give a bit more maturity for the grapes during the entire year. But also, I don't know if you realized, a lot of these stones are actually quite light in color. So the fact that lighted color, it gives an extra percentage of light, which means an extra percentage of photosynthesis. It may sound very little, but all these little factors added together allow us to mature the Cabernet Sauvignon. And worldwide, the best, the most complex wine are produced in the limit of the maturity. When the grape matures very slowly, still manage to reach maturity, but in a very slow manner. This is why, Chablis, Burgundy produce the best Chardonnay, and above this, you will not find Chardonnay. Well, things change a bit with Champagne now in global warming, but rule of thumb, no, this is it. You will not find Syrah above Côte Rôtie, and Côte Rôtie is one of the best. You will not find Cabernet Sauvignon above Bordeaux. You will not find Cabernet Franc above the Loire, and all these regions are just considered the best of the best for these different grape varieties. You can also reach the limit with altitude. This is why all the new worlds try to reach this limit of production with altitude, recreating this cool sort of coolish temperature.
I think that's a fascinating point, Damien, that your balance on a knife edge in Bordeaux, as you are right now with the frosts, for example. I mean, it is the extremes that you can't be guaranteed the same wine every year, and that's what makes it so fascinating. But of course, for you as the chateau owners and the winemakers, so perilous. So I think we were suggesting before a guest joined us. Bordeaux, and not just Bordeaux, a lot of France is facing another night and morning of potentially heavy frost. So that must be really quite challenging and worrying for you both.
Yes, well, as long as it stays challenging, it's still positive because we can do something about it. But once it's frozen and you have little brown leaves, it's extremely sad.
Yeah, we try to fight, like we can. It's very difficult to find frost, fight. The most way is spraying water above it. Strangely enough, it goes back to your physics lessons. When water changes state and change from liquid to solid, it gives heat. It supplies heat to whatever it's forming around. So as long as you are forming ice around the leaf, you are creating heat, which is protecting the leaf inside the shell of ice. Although we have the river close by, still too far to be able to pump and spray the vineyard with it. But this is what they do actually in Champagne. They take a lot from the river and spray it, or places that are near lakes like Switzerland. So for us here, we have two solutions. We have the candle, which we've been using this morning in Mauvesin, and you can also create a lot of smoke. Well, actually, the Seychelles this morning had been using actually smoke generator like nightclubs, and we've been burning hay that we usually give to the horses.
Yeah, they're on a diet now.
Try and create lots of smoke. So yes, the most effective is candles, but we do need tons and tons of candles, and it takes quite a few minutes to light all of them. But I think we've managed to protect our 2 hectares this morning.
Where we are also very frustrated is that we have bought what you call the towers with
windmills.
And we bought the new ones that actually heat a bit as well. The trouble with world transport today is that these mills are in fact in the Canal of Panama. So we have a problem in Canal of Panama and Suez, and our windmills are the other side of the Atlantic for the moment.
That's no good. You'll have to get the Barton team of helicopters, mini helicopters, I think, flying around, for all 12 hours. But
Rose.
Well, certainly we certainly wish you well, and fingers crossed for the next few evenings, right until pretty much the end of April. Looking at our 15 and 16, our last two wines. I mean, this is another phenomenal pair of wines. Please lead us through these 2 vintages.
Well, quickly, I'll say the differences, which again are only in style. To me, the 15s are more serious wines in a way, and more typical. Whereas I find that the 16s have a lot more lightness to them. I find they're more smiling wines, not in texture, but in enjoyment of the wine. I find that it's an easier, or more smiling approach to the 16s.
I'm a big fan of the 16s. 15 is I find somewhere between 9 and 10 in a way, where it was quite warm, but you have this you have an acidity and you have finesse at the same time. It's a great wine. 16, what I love is the touch of the tannin on the palate. There's this silkiness sits, and you have this acidity. Usually you tend to have in tannins, but as Lilian says, not at all. There's no acidity in this wine. It's long and it's delicate, and it really doesn't lack of aromas at the same time. I'm a big fan of the 16s.
Just to show off a bit, it's not Langoa, but it's Léoville. Léoville was accorded the best wine in last year in the Wine Spectator. Rather, I should say the year before now.
Bravo, absolutely. And sorry, that was the 16 or the
16.
It was the 16, wasn't it? Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting having these two vintages, having started with the 9 and 10, you know, the last great pair. Unlike the 9 and 10, here the cepage is similar in the sense, very similar amount of Cabernet Sauvignon. But I noticed that there's a rather higher degree of Cabernet Franc in the 15, 12% versus 8%. I would like to think I can pick that up on the nose in the 15, but that's because I've got it in front of me, you know. So, but I think there is a slightly herbaceous edge to the 15, which maybe comes from the Cabernet Franc. Do you pick that up at all, or am I being fanciful?
Well, where you are right is that because Langoa tends to be quite round, it's quite nice to have this touch of Cabernet Franc, because Cabernet Franc, the left bank, rarely matures perfectly. So there's always this slightly herbaceous notes when we taste a Cabernet Franc on its own. And to me, in the blend of Langoa, it really gives a nice, refreshing, almost sort of mentally eucalyptus sometime. And the reason why they're locked in the 15, it's because it's quite a warm vintage, and the maturity of the Cabernet Franc was very good. So we did put a lot of it. Herbaceous, I don't know, I've never really picked it up. Maybe I'll concentrate a bit more next time.
Or maybe I was being fanciful. It's certainly possible. And it's also interesting, and I'd be keen to hear some of our attendees, some of our guests think this evening. For me, even in the hour that we've been on the call with you this evening, both the 15 and the 16 have opened up tremendously. They're softened beautifully. I think the 16 initially this evening was really quite tight, but already even now I can get that charm which you were both referring to. It's I'm surprised, if I'm honest. I thought this should stick in a cellar for at least another 10 years minimum, but I'd probably be tempted to open a bottle or two in the next 4 or 5 years.
The one wine which I'm always surprised is the Langoa 50. When I do tasting it, from the moment I open it to the last glass, the wine really changes so much. And you would think that it's still young, but with a bit of the wine really suddenly shines, and it's a beautiful wine. Having this with a nice steak is just perfect.
Talking of which, you're sitting in front of Château Langoa. Thank you very much for finding the photo. I see it's summer because of the orange trees. But just to make it clear, it is Château Langoa, although my ancestors must have been very lazy and misguided, shoved it on the label of Léoville.
I wonder how many people realize that when they see the bottles, actually. But
probably not many.
now you know, you're amongst the privileged few who have been given the truth of the matter. Perfect. Here we go.
Yeah, so the bottle of Léoville with the Château Langoa on it's very confusing. So
and the two gates.
Yes, exactly. So this is on the Route du Château. This is what you would see from the road. So yeah, the Château Langoa on the label of Léoville, very confusing.
Yeah. And I think again to unpack that a little bit further for our guests this evening, the wines of both chateaux or both labels are made at Langoa. Is that still the case?
Yes.
It is, exactly. The way well, let me show you a picture of the battery. So this place has both wines. The only way we know what's what is by having we have a little board that we know that's on the vat number 27. We have the block 33, which is the vines of Langoa, and the vat next to it is the block 4, which belongs to the vineyard of Léoville. And it's pretty much as simple as this. And this is where it's quite interesting. The team in the vineyard is the same. The vats are the same. The aging in the barrels is the same coop, same heat percentage of new oak. So everything is the same except the origin of the vineyard, and this is where it's quite fun to see the difference.
Proves the terroir is important.
Yeah, absolutely. Terroir is a concept which is not talked about as often in Bordeaux as it is in Burgundy in every conversation from breakfast until bedtime. But it's I think maybe that's a tasting we will do later in the year or next year, where we would compare and contrast Léoville and Langoa, I think, and then people could try that for themselves. But certainly I think this is, yeah.
Because I've done several tastings where the two wines were there, served blind, sometimes in pairs, and people asked to say which is Langoa, which is Léoville. And at least half the time they got it wrong.
Well, it's certainly been a fascinating vertical. We've done a number of really interesting tastings from around the world. We've started looking at Bordeaux now, obviously in relation to the interest which is slowly but surely gathering around 2020. It's been a real treat to try these wines, a real education, wonderful to have you both with us. Perhaps you'd say a few words now to everyone about the 2020 vintage, because I'm sure we've got some keen Bordeaux en primeur buyers with us this evening, and they'd love to know your thoughts.
And maybe there are a few questions later.
Absolutely.
2020, yes, well, as we were Daniel about the weather pattern, but after all, it's the main ingredient after the terroir for making a good vintage. But I find the 2020, we're very pleased with it. Of course, we're going to say 3rd year running with a very nice vintage. Never mind, we made 3 years running very nice vintages. Lovely wine. Slightly sad news is that we've made quite a bit less of it this year, due partly to less grapes and maybe the dryness, slightly smaller grapes, thick skins, big pips, so less wine all round.
Yeah, exactly. A bit less wine because summer was very dry, but it started off quite hectic because we had snow on the 30th of March, which was quite so we were quite afraid of frost, but then a week later came thunderstorms, so it heated up very quickly, lots of hail, so we managed to escape very narrowly from a severe damage of hail. And then just a few drops on the early flowering, but overall the flowering happened quite well. And then beautiful, dry, sunny summer. Sunny, but not warm, and that's very key because when it's because sun gives the photosynthesis and the sugar and the ripeness, but heat then gives transform aromas to make something like 2009. So we've kept something that's very balanced, fairly low alcohol, and superb freshness, acidity, and the tannins is ripe. The aromas are present as well. So yes, it's an exciting vintage, and especially, you know, for us having worked this entire year under COVID stress, you know, taking these grapes till the end, harvesting by hand, you know, there was a lot more challenges, would I say, this year than than we usually have. So achieving all of this and having a great wine at the end, and the only frustration we could have is volume. For us, that's very positive.
Yeah, excellent. Well, I'm very glad to hear that we've got another good looking vintage coming up. Thank you once again for joining us this evening. And for those who have to duck out now, thank you for joining us. For those who'd like to stay and have any questions or comments you'd like to pose to Lilian and Damien, then please do. And just once again, I'll just raise a glass to you both. Thank you so much for your time this evening. Much appreciated.
Thank you,
Thank you very much. Cheers to everyone. Thank you.
So please do unmute yourself, anyone who's still staying with us, if there are those comments or questions that you wanted to raise. I did see a comment there from Dylan here, saying that the tannins of the 16 are very fine grained, smooth and ripe, and not grippy, which is surprising. I suppose that's because we have an idea of 16 being quite a structured vintage. Why is this perhaps not? Why are we not maybe seeing this tonight with the 16?
Well, I think just because it needs a bit of air.
Well, I
it smells like this, because to me, 16 is exactly as Dylan described it.
Yeah. Okay. So perhaps, Dylan, were you expecting the 16 to be more tannic, more sort of less accessible? Is that where the surprise comes?
Oh. Yeah, sorry, Dylan is the name of my son. It's Alan here, but yeah, I mean, I think for a relatively young wine, I was expecting it to be to sense the tannins a lot more, and for them to be more chewy and a bit grippy, and they were so smooth that and fine grained that was quite surprising in a wine that's only 5 or 6 years old.
Well, there are different sorts of tannins for a start, and also we're always very careful on the extraction when the grapes are in the vines of the pumping over and so on. We prefer the rather more delicate side of it and try not to get too much of the harshness out of the grapes. So we're always treating our grapes very, very politely and kindly, so we don't get too much of this roughness out of it.
And also, as I was saying, 16, this is why I love this vintage, because it has a lot of tannin, like analytically, it has more tannin than the 2010. But it's as you mentioned, the touch of the tannin, the finesse of it is not something we can really control, and that's the beauty of the vintage effect.
Yeah. Perhaps it's just the intensity of the fruit nicely outweighs the tannins in this respect. So yeah, I'm sure it will still be a long-lived vintage 16. I think it's yeah, it's just showing impressive balance right now.
I can see Nathan has a question.
Yeah, I'm always the wine buyer, Damien. So what I want to ask is, with 2020 en primeur coming up, you've treated us to these marvelous 6 different vintages, back vintages. Thank you so much. They're just gorgeous. But which of these vintages will the 2020 most taste like in a few years' time?
I find it's an impossible question to answer.
I like to ask impossible questions.
I would say 10.
Yeah. 15.
Go on, fight.
Yeah, to me it has. I love the touch of the tannins on it. But I would not say it's as delicate as the 16. But it's still very fine. And in terms of freshness, there's really a fresh fruit. So I wouldn't say it's 9 or 15, because these wines have quite some warmth, quite some warm expression to it. But it really doesn't lack of expression at the same time. So and we are on a serious vintage, so to me it's really a step above 12 and 13. So
even above 8, I would have said.
Yeah, so by deduction, I would say 10 to me is the closer.
Well done. Thank you for answering the impossible.
Were there any more comments or questions? I'm just going through the chat if we've missed anything there. Oh, again, well, this was Alan's comment about exceptions to the rule of extremes, looking at Barolo. It's possibly a conversation for another time, but I think, yeah, Barolo's also enjoyed a very interesting run of vintages, some of which you could transpose across to Bordeaux. 15 and 16 had similar characters in Bordeaux and in Piedmont, but yeah, extremes. I think Barolo can be pretty extreme too in terms of climate and temperature and the weather conditions. Nathan was mentioning that the 17, back to the 17 vintage, similar with Burgundy, classics in 10 years time. I think it will be really interesting revisiting the 17 vintage, not just in 10 years time, but even in 5 years time. I think it could be another vintage which doesn't necessarily close down. I think in Bordeaux, there might be the indication that 17 will just continue to evolve very gracefully and give pleasure throughout. Do you think that might be the case with your 17s?
Yeah, it could easily happen that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It'd be nice to know you've always got a vintage that's good to drink, rather than, Damien, as you were saying, opening one and going, be better in 5 years, and then 5 years later, better in 2 years. So, that's the way.
But Tom, as somebody collecting wine, I love those vintages because everybody underrates them at the time. They, frankly as well, they go down a bit in price after 2 or 3 years, and then you snap them up and they're just going to be gorgeous drinking wines. And I think 17 and Burgundy is an absolute classic. Well, everybody knew it on the whites, but particularly the reds, I think, were way underrated. It's great to hear that about your 17s as well.
Yeah, I agree with you. 17s in Burgundy, well, of course, whites are stellar, one of the best. And in red, if the places that didn't suffer from hail have actually beautiful, delicate fruit with good freshness, and
the aromatics are outstanding.
Yeah, definitely. So yes, if in Bordeaux, the places that did not suffer from match frost very well, actually make very good wine.
And
we'll come and taste it.
Can't wait. We also had a comment here from Elliot about, did the 10 or 9 have the same fruit weight as 16 at a similar age?
Good question. Thank you very much for asking.
Well, 9 definitely. 9 has alwaes been very open and forward and expressive. 9 is quite impressive in that it did not go through an austere period. 10, I forgot when it closed down. 10 was not an easy vintage.
10 went through a stage where it was always big and massive and not particularly showing its best. It wasn't. It was just bad-tempered.
Yeah, well, it was a teenager.
It was a teenager. And we'll see how 16 evolves. For the moment,
it's just interesting how integrated tannins are in the 16.
Yes, yes, I love the 16s, and we'll see what happens. It could still close up. I don't think it will, but I'm often wrong.
It's still a bit shy, but no, although the fruit doesn't obviously shine, there's really this touch on the palate that I love, where 10 needs the fruits to be able to balance this tannins that are still quite big.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much indeed once again. Unless there are any other comments or questions, then I think we'll draw things to a close and let you go and get your dinners. Perhaps it'll be some salmon belly with the 13, or a delicious steak with the 12, or both, frankly. I like the idea of that. A first course, main course, Langoa dinner pairing would be tremendous. But thank you once again, both of you, so much for joining us, for showing off these wines. It's been a real pleasure. And we wish you the very best with the frosts for the coming weeks, for sure, fingers crossed, and with the presentation of the 2020 vintage, which we're all very excited to taste and to start telling everyone about. So thank you very much indeed, Lilian and Damien. It's been a pleasure.
Merci.
I look forward to seeing you for real.
Yes.
Merci.
Merci, au revoir.
Au revoir, bonne soirée.
Bonsoir.
Bonsoir.
Bye.
Thank you so much.